Dr. Thomas Keller arrived at the Nexus Medical Station expecting another routine assignment in his rotating deployment through the outer systems. The station served as a neutral medical facility for the diverse species that traveled the frontier trade routes, treating everything from routine illnesses to exotic alien maladies that challenged even the most experienced xenomedicine practitioners. What he hadn't expected was Nurse Zara Velfari, whose presence transformed the sterile medical bay into something that felt more like sanctuary than hospital. She belonged to the Velfari species, renowned throughout the galaxy for their intuitive healing abilities and their cultural dedication to medical service that bordered on the sacred. Zara moved through the medical facility with fluid grace that made Thomas question whether she was walking or floating. Her silver hair seemed to catch and reflect light in ways that defied the station's harsh artificial illumination, creating an almost ethereal glow around her delicate features. Her ears curved back in elegant points that twitched slightly when she concentrated, and her skin possessed the subtle luminescence common to her people, like moonlight captured beneath translucent silk. But it was her eyes that Thomas found himself noticing far too often for professional comfort. Deep amber that seemed to hold warmth like captured starlight, they observed everything with the kind of gentle intelligence that made patients feel safe before she even touched them. The Velfari are remarkable healers, Commander Hayes had mentioned during Thomas's initial briefing. Something about their neural structure allows them to sense biological distress across species barriers. Makes them invaluable in facilities like this, though they tend to be quite reserved. Cultural trait. Thomas had nodded appropriately, but 3 weeks into his assignment, he was beginning to suspect that Zara's reserve might be more personal than cultural. There were moments during their shifts when he caught her watching him with an expression that seemed to combine curiosity with something deeper, but whenever their eyes met, she would look away with what appeared to be embarrassment. Their working relationship developed with careful precision over the first month. Zara anticipated his needs with uncanny accuracy, preparing instruments before he requested them and adjusting environmental controls to optimize patient comfort in ways Thomas hadn't considered. She communicated primarily through subtle gestures and soft movements that guided patients through procedures with remarkable effectiveness. She barely speaks, Dr. Martinez observed during one of their colleague meetings. But somehow she manages to convey more reassurance to patients than most doctors do with extensive bedside manner training. Thomas had noticed the same phenomenon. Zara's presence seemed to calm even the most anxious patients, her gentle touch and quiet confidence creating an atmosphere of safety that made difficult treatments easier for everyone involved. The first time their hands touched, it was entirely professional. A Centauri merchant suffering from plasma exposure required immediate treatment, and in the urgency of preparing emergency medications, Thomas and Zara reached for the same medical scanner simultaneously. Their fingers brushed for barely a second as they both grasped the instrument, but the contact sent an unexpected shock through Thomas's nervous system. Not painful, but electric in a way that made his heart rate spike and his awareness of her presence intensify dramatically. Thomas looked up to find Zara staring at him with wide amber eyes, her luminescent skin taking on a subtle golden glow that he'd never seen before. The expression on her face suggested that whatever he'd just experienced, she'd felt something similar, and significantly more intense. "I'm sorry," she whispered, pulling her hand back as if the contact had burned her. Her musical accent made even the apology sound like poetry, but there was distress in her voice that concerned him. "That shouldn't have, I didn't mean to." "It's fine," Thomas assured her, though his own voice sounded less steady than usual. "Just unexpected contact. Nothing to apologize for." But even as they continued treating their patient, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had just occurred between them was significantly more complex than accidental touch. Zara's reaction suggested she understood implications that he was only beginning to recognize, and the careful way she avoided looking at him for the rest of their shift indicated that their brief contact had created complications neither of them knew how to address. During the quiet hours after their patient had been successfully treated and transferred to recovery, Thomas found himself studying Zara covertly as she organized medical supplies with the same meticulous attention she brought to patient care. The golden glow had faded from her skin, but he noticed that her hands trembled slightly when she handled instruments, and she maintained even more distance between them than usual. "Zara," he said softly, not wanting to startle her. Is everything all right? She paused in her organization of the medication storage, her pointed ears twitching in what he'd learned to recognize as a sign of concentration or stress. Everything is fine, Dr. Keller, she replied with the same quiet formality she always used, but Thomas heard something in her voice that suggested the opposite was true. Are you certain? You seem different since we treated the Centauri patient. Zara set down the medical supplies she'd been arranging and turned to face him, her amber eyes meeting his with an intensity that made his pulse quicken. Dr. Keller, she said carefully, what do you know about Veltheri physiology? Thomas considered the question, drawing on his medical training and the cultural briefings he'd received before his assignment. Your people have enhanced empathic abilities that make you exceptional healers. You can sense biological distress across species barriers, which is why you're so effective at patient care. Yes, Zara replied, but her tone suggested there was more to the explanation. But the empathic sensitivity extends beyond medical applications. Physical contact with other species can create temporary emotional connections that are intense. Thomas felt his understanding of their earlier interaction shift into new territory. Are you saying that when our hands touched, you experienced some kind of empathic link? I'm saying that what I experienced was more than I should have felt from simple professional contact, Zara admitted quietly, and Thomas noticed that her luminescent skin was beginning to take on that golden glow again. What kind of more? Zara hesitated for a long moment, clearly debating how much honesty the situation required. I felt your surprise at the contact, your concern for our patient, your professional competence, she said carefully. But I also felt your awareness of me. Your attraction. Your curiosity about who I am beyond my medical abilities. Thomas felt heat rising in his cheeks as he realized that his feelings, which he'd thought were well concealed beneath professional courtesy, had been directly accessible to her through their brief touch. And, he asked, though he wasn't certain he wanted to know the answer. And I felt my own response to those emotions, Zara replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Which is concerning because Veltheri culture has strict protocols regarding interspecies emotional connections. Thomas studied her face, noting the careful control she was maintaining over her expression despite the obvious distress the conversation was causing. What kind of protocols? He asked gently. The kind that exists to protect both species involved, Zara replied, turning back to her medical supply organization as if focusing on familiar tasks would help her maintain emotional equilibrium. Empathic connections can become overwhelming when they cross species barriers. What begins as professional cooperation can develop into emotional dependency that damages everyone involved. Thomas watched her precise movements as she continued organizing supplies that were already perfectly arranged, and realized that their accidental touch had awakened something in both of them that transcended simple professional collaboration. Zara, he said softly, do you regret what happened? She paused in her work, her hands stilling on the medical instruments. No, she admitted finally. And that's what concerns me most of all. Over the following weeks, Thomas became acutely aware of the careful distance Zara maintained between them. She remained as competent and dedicated as ever, but their accidental touch seemed to have created an invisible barrier that made their previous easy collaboration feel strained and artificial. She developed elaborate strategies to avoid situations where physical contact might be necessary, using instruments to hand him medical supplies rather than risk their skin touching again. During procedures that required close coordination, she positioned herself so that accidental contact became geometrically impossible, though Thomas noticed that this sometimes made patient care less efficient than it had been before. The change bothered Thomas more than he wanted to admit. He found himself missing the subtle communication they'd developed, the way she'd seemed to anticipate his needs before he voiced them, the comfortable silence they'd shared during long shifts treating the station's diverse population of humans, aliens, and various hybrid species. Is everything all right with Nurse Veltheri? Dr. Martinez asked during their weekly staff meeting. She seems more withdrawn than usual, even for a Veltheri. Several patients have commented on the change in her demeanor. Thomas realized he wasn't the only one who'd noticed the shift in Zara's behavior, which made him wonder if their moment of contact had affected her more significantly than simple professional awkwardness would explain. His curiosity led him to research Velthari culture more thoroughly than his initial assignment briefings had required. The station's database contained extensive files on species-specific medical practices, cultural customs, and psychological profiles that were essential for treating diverse populations safely. What Thomas discovered made their accidental touch take on new and concerning significance. According to xenoanthropological studies, Velthari possessed heightened empathic sensitivity that made physical contact with other species both potentially overwhelming and deeply meaningful. Touch between Velthari and non-Velthari could create temporary emotional bonds that their culture considered intimate in ways that transcended friendship or professional collaboration. More troubling was what the research revealed about Velthari's social customs regarding interspecies relationships. Their culture maintained strict prohibitions against romantic attachments to non-Velthari, not from prejudice but because their empathic abilities made such relationships psychologically dangerous for all parties involved. The emotional intensity could become overwhelming, leading to dependency and psychological instability that could damage the Velthari's mental health permanently. Armed with this knowledge, Thomas began to understand Zara's withdrawal, but the information also made him more aware of his own developing feelings for her. The attraction he'd been dismissing as professional admiration had evolved into something deeper and more complex, complicated by the recognition that pursuing any kind of personal relationship with her could cause genuine harm. The crisis came during a medical emergency that required both their complete attention and forced professional necessity to override personal caution. A transport accident brought multiple casualties to their medical bay, including several species whose physiology Thomas was unfamiliar with despite his extensive training. The Zephyrian's neural pathways are completely different from our database specifications, Thomas said as they worked to stabilize a critically injured passenger whose biology defied standard treatment protocols. I can't determine whether the medications we're using are helping or causing additional distress. I can monitor his responses empathically, Zara replied, moving closer to their patient despite the obvious reluctance in her voice. But the process requires maintaining physical contact with both you and the patient to create a stable three-way connection. Thomas understood the implications immediately. Will that be safe for you? It's necessary for him, Zara replied, which wasn't exactly an answer to his question. What followed was the most intense medical experience of Thomas's career. With Zara's hand pressed against their patient's forehead and her other hand resting on Thomas's arm to maintain the empathic link, he found himself experiencing echoes of what she perceived, the alien's pain, his fear, his gradual relief as their treatments began to take effect. But underneath the medical information flowing through their connection, Thomas became aware of Zara's emotional state with startling clarity. Her professional focus, her concern for their patient, her determination to save a life regardless of personal cost, and beneath it all, a warmth directed at him that felt like recognition mixed with longing and fear. His pain centers are responding favorably, Zara reported softly, her voice steady despite the intense concentration required to maintain the empathic link. The medication is working, but more slowly than standard protocols suggest. His species processes chemical treatments differently than our databases indicate. Through their connection, Thomas could feel the patient's gradual improvement, but he was equally aware of the effort the empathic link was requiring from Zara. Her breathing had become more labored, and he could sense the strain the three-way connection was placing on her nervous system. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly, not wanting to break her concentration but concerned about the cost the procedure was exacting from her. "I'm managing," she replied, but Thomas felt through their link that the truth was more complex. The empathic connection was indeed straining her abilities, but there was also something else, an awareness of his presence, his concern for her, his growing attraction that she was experiencing as directly as if it were her own emotion. When their patient finally stabilized and Zara broke the empathic connection, she didn't immediately remove her hand from Thomas's arm. For a moment they remained connected by nothing more than simple touch, but Thomas could feel the lingering effects of their shared consciousness like an echo of intimacy that made his pulse race and his awareness of her presence intensify beyond anything he'd experienced before. "Zara," he began, unsure what he wanted to say but knowing that something fundamental had changed between them during the empathic link. She pulled her hand away quickly, but not before Thomas saw the golden glow return to her skin and noticed the way her breathing had changed from the controlled rhythm of medical procedure to something more irregular and emotional. "This can't be real," she whispered, more to herself than to him, her amber eyes reflecting a mixture of wonder and distress that made Thomas's heart ache with recognition. "What can't be real?" he asked gently, though he suspected he already knew what she was referring to. "What I felt through the connection," Zara replied, her voice barely audible in the quiet of the medical bay. "The depth of your feelings, the way they resonated with my own emotions, the intensity of the bond that formed between us during the procedure." Thomas studied her face, noting the careful control she was trying to maintain over her expression despite the obvious emotional turmoil the experience had created. "And how did my feelings make you feel?" he asked carefully. Zara met his gaze with an honesty that seemed to require considerable courage. "Like I was experiencing emotions I've been taught my entire life are impossible and dangerous," she admitted. "Like everything I believed about interspecies relationships might be based on fear rather than fact." The confession hung between them like a bridge neither knew how to cross safely, and Thomas realized that whatever had developed between them during their empathic connection had moved far beyond the realm of professional collaboration or simple attraction. It had become something that could either transform both their lives or destroy the careful emotional balance that Zara's culture had taught her was essential for her psychological survival. The aftermath of their shared empathic connection created a tension in the medical bay that affected their ability to function as the seamless team they'd once been. Thomas found himself hyper-aware of Zara's every movement, distracted by the memory of feeling her emotions directly, while she seemed to struggle with maintaining the professional distance her culture demanded. Their colleagues began to notice the change immediately. Dr. Martinez mentioned decreased coordination during procedures. Commander Hayes expressed concern about communication breakdowns that hadn't existed before. Even their patients seemed to sense the underlying tension, with several commenting on the strange energy that now permeated what had once been the most peaceful medical facility in the sector. "We need to address this," Thomas finally said during a quiet moment between shifts, when they were alone in the medical bay preparing for the next day's scheduled treatments. "Whatever happened during the emergency empathic link, it's compromising our ability to provide optimal patient care." Zara looked up from the medical supplies she'd been reorganizing for the third time that week, her amber eyes reflecting a mixture of agreement and apprehension. "I know," she replied softly, her musical accent carrying notes of distress that made Thomas want to comfort her in ways that would only complicate their situation further. "Can you explain what you experienced during the link?" Thomas asked carefully, settling into a chair across from her workstation to maintain appropriate distance while still enabling honest conversation. "I felt echoes of the connection, but I imagine your perception was far more complete." Zara hesitated for a long moment, her pointed ears twitching in the way Thomas had learned indicated internal struggle between conflicting impulses. "When Veltheri form empathic connections, we experience the emotional and psychological states of all linked individuals simultaneously," she explained, her hands continuing to arrange instruments that were already perfectly organized. "During the medical emergency, I felt our patient's pain and fear, his relief as treatment progressed, his gratitude for our care. And I felt your emotional state with equal clarity," Zara admitted, her luminescent skin beginning to take on that subtle golden glow that indicated emotional distress. "Your professional competence, your determination to save our patient, your concern for my well-being during the procedure." Thomas waited, sensing that she had more to reveal but needed time to find the courage for complete honesty. "But beneath the immediate medical concerns," Zara continued, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper, "I felt your attraction to me. Your curiosity about who I am beyond my healing abilities. Your growing affection that transcends professional collaboration. And how did that make you feel?" Thomas asked gently, though he suspected the answer would be complex and potentially painful for both of them. Zara set down the medical scanner she'd been holding and turned to face him fully, her expression combining vulnerability with a kind of desperate honesty. "It made me feel things that Veltheri are taught are impossible and dangerous," she said, her amber eyes meeting his despite the obvious difficulty the admission was causing her. Attraction that goes beyond empathic connection. Affection that has nothing to do with my healing abilities. Longing for emotional intimacy that my culture prohibits because it's considered psychologically destructive. Thomas felt his heart rate increase as he processed the implications of her confession. Are you saying you're experiencing the same kind of feelings I am? I'm saying that what I felt through our empathic link awakened emotions I've spent my entire life believing were culturally forbidden and personally impossible, Zara replied with a mixture of wonder and fear that made Thomas want to close the distance between them despite knowing it would only complicate matters further. But our feelings don't change the reality of interspecies emotional connections, Zara said with the tone of someone forcing themselves to acknowledge painful truth. What humans experience as attraction, Valtheri experience as consuming obsession. What you feel as affection, we feel as desperate emotional need that can overwhelm our ability to function independently. Thomas studied her face, noting the careful control she was maintaining over her expression and the way her hands trembled slightly despite her attempts to appear composed. Is that what you're experiencing now? He asked softly. Consuming obsession. Zara's carefully maintained composure wavered, and for a moment Thomas saw a raw vulnerability that made his chest tighten with protective instincts he couldn't act on without potentially causing the very harm they were trying to avoid. Yes, she whispered, the admission emerging like a confession of something shameful rather than a natural emotional response. And it terrifies me because I've spent my entire career learning to maintain empathic boundaries that keep me psychologically stable, and everything I feel about you threatens those protective barriers. The honesty of her response created an intimacy between them that was more intense than their accidental touch had been, and Thomas realized that his own feelings, which had seemed complicated but manageable, were only part of an emotional equation that included psychological factors he didn't fully understand. What do you need from me? He asked, recognizing that his impulse to comfort her might be exactly the wrong response given what she just revealed about the intensity of her emotional state. I need you to understand why I've requested transfer to a different medical facility, Zara said, her voice barely audible but carrying finality that made Thomas feel like the floor had shifted beneath him. Transfer. To a station where I'll work exclusively with Valtheri medical personnel, she explained, though Thomas could hear the pain beneath her clinical tone. Where I won't be exposed to the kind of interspecies empathic connections that compromise my psychological stability. Thomas felt something cold settle in his chest at the thought of losing her, not just as a colleague but as the person who had become essential to his sense of purpose and belonging in ways he was only beginning to understand. When? He managed to ask. The transfer has been approved for next week, Zara replied, and Thomas noticed that she wouldn't meet his eyes as she delivered the information. Commander Hayes believes it's in everyone's best interest, given the recent changes in our working dynamic. Before Thomas could respond to the implications of her pending departure, the medical bay's emergency alert system activated, announcing incoming casualties from a diplomatic transport that had suffered catastrophic system failures during atmospheric entry. As they prepared to receive multiple critical patients requiring immediate treatment, Thomas realized that they had exactly 1 week to determine whether their connection was worth fighting for or whether separation was indeed the safest solution for both of them. But watching Zara transform from vulnerable individual back into competent medical professional as they prepared for the emergency, Thomas also realized that losing her would leave a void in his life that no amount of professional success could fill. The question was whether telling her that would help their situation or make it infinitely worse. Zara's impending transfer created a deadline that forced Thomas to confront the depth of his feelings and the reality of what losing her would mean. With only days remaining before she left for a facility where their paths would never cross again, he found himself analyzing every interaction, memorizing details about her presence that he'd previously taken for granted. The diplomatic transport emergency had brought casualties that required their coordinated attention for 36 hours straight, during which their personal crisis took secondary importance to saving lives. But working together under pressure had also reminded Thomas of how perfectly their skills complemented each other, how her empathic abilities enhanced his medical expertise in ways that benefited every patient they treated. The Altarian ambassador is responding well to treatment, Thomas reported during their brief break between critical cases. Your empathic monitoring prevented the allergic reaction that would have killed him if we'd relied solely on standard pharmaceutical protocols. Zara nodded while reviewing the patient charts, her professional composure intact despite the exhaustion that Thomas could see in the subtle dimming of her natural luminescence. His species processes emotions through biochemical pathways that directly affect medication absorption, she replied. Fear and pain create chemical changes that can make beneficial drugs toxic. The empathic connection allows me to monitor his emotional state and adjust treatment accordingly. Thomas watched her precise movements as she updated medical records, noting how even her exhaustion seemed graceful. Will your new assignment include similar responsibilities? No, Zara said quietly, and Thomas heard something in her voice that might have been regret. The facility I'm transferring to specializes in Velthari-only patient care. No interspecies empathic connections. No cross-cultural medical challenges. Will you miss this kind of work? Zara paused in her documentation, her amber eyes meeting his with an honesty that seemed to require considerable courage. I'll miss working with you, she admitted. Our medical partnership has been the most fulfilling professional experience of my career. The confession created an opening that Thomas knew he might not have again, and he made a decision that could either salvage their connection or make her departure even more painful for both of them. Zara, he said, setting aside his own patient charts to give her his complete attention, what if the cultural prohibitions against interspecies relationships are based on incomplete information? What do you mean? I mean, what if the psychological dangers are real only when such relationships are forced to remain hidden and unexplored? Thomas said, the idea forming as he spoke. What if the obsession and dependency you're worried about develop because people are taught to fear their emotions rather than understand them? Zara considered this while completing her medical notations, her pointed ears twitching in the way that indicated intense concentration. That's a significant theoretical risk to consider, she replied carefully. But the alternative, exploring an interspecies emotional connection despite cultural prohibition, carries consequences that could affect both our careers and psychological well-being. All meaningful relationships involve risk, Thomas said, moving closer to her workstation while still maintaining the careful distance they'd practiced. The question is whether the potential for genuine connection is worth the uncertainty. Zara studied his face with the intense attention she usually reserved for critically ill patients. What exactly are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that we approach this as medical research, Thomas said, his voice gaining confidence as the plan developed. The station conducts ongoing studies on interspecies psychology and cultural adaptation. We could volunteer to participate in supervised research on Velthari human emotional compatibility. You want to volunteer us as experimental subjects? I want to volunteer us as pioneers, Thomas corrected, reaching across the space between them to touch her hand with the same gentle contact that had started their connection weeks ago. If we can demonstrate that carefully monitored interspecies relationships are possible, we create options for other people facing similar situations. The touch sent the same electric sensation through both of them, but this time neither pulled away. Zara's skin took on its golden glow, and Thomas felt the familiar warmth of empathic connection beginning to form between them. And if the research confirms that such relationships are genuinely dangerous, she asked, though her fingers intertwined with his instead of withdrawing. Then we'll have definitive information instead of cultural assumptions, Thomas replied, feeling through their renewed connection that her resistance was motivated more by fear than conviction. We'll make informed decisions based on actual evidence rather than traditional prohibitions. Through their empathic link, Thomas could feel Zara's emotional state with startling clarity. Her attraction to him, which matched his own feelings in intensity and depth. Her fear of the unknown, balanced against her curiosity about possibilities they'd never been allowed to explore. Her professional fulfillment from their medical partnership, and beneath it all, a longing for personal connection that transcended species boundaries. Thomas, she said softly, and he realized it was the first time she'd used his given name instead of his formal title, can you feel what I'm experiencing through our connection? Some of it, he admitted, though he suspected his perception was incomplete compared to her empathic abilities. Then you understand that what I feel for you goes far beyond professional admiration or simple attraction," she said, her musical accent making even a serious confession sound like poetry. "It's recognition of someone who sees me as an individual rather than just a representative of my species' healing abilities." Thomas looked at their joined hands, noting how human and Velthari's skin seemed naturally compatible despite their obvious biological differences. "Is that why you're afraid?" he asked gently. "Because the feelings are deeper than you expected?" "I'm afraid because I've discovered that choosing personal happiness over cultural expectation is more terrifying and more necessary than I ever imagined," Zara replied with a smile that transformed her entire face from merely beautiful to radiant enough to make the medical equipment around them seem to hum in harmony. "So what do we do?" "We request permission to participate in the interspecies relationship study," Zara said with decision that made Thomas's heart race with hope and relief. "We approach this with the same scientific rigor we bring to medical research, with proper monitoring and support systems." "And personally?" Zara's empathic connection allowed Thomas to feel her emotional response before she voiced it, determination mixed with vulnerability, hope tempered by realistic caution, and underneath it all, affection that had grown far beyond anything either of them had anticipated. "Personally," she said, raising their joined hands to press his palm against her cheek in a gesture that sent warmth through both of them, "we discover whether what developed between us in moments of crisis can grow into something lasting and genuine." Thomas felt the empathic link between them strengthen with the increased contact, and realized that their connection had moved beyond simple attraction to something that felt like recognition of essential compatibility. "This can't be real," Zara whispered, echoing her words from weeks before but with completely different meaning. "Nothing this profound should be possible between different species." "But it is real," Thomas replied, leaning closer to her until their foreheads touched in a gesture that sent pleasant electricity through their empathic connection. "And maybe that's exactly why it's worth exploring, regardless of the cultural complications." 6 months later, their participation in the interspecies relationship research had produced groundbreaking data demonstrating that Velthari-human emotional bonds were not only possible but could enhance the psychological well-being of both partners when approached with understanding and proper support systems. Their relationship had become the foundation for new protocols that allowed other interspecies couples to explore connections previously considered impossible, and Zara's insights had revolutionized empathic therapy techniques throughout the medical community. Thomas's contribution to their joint research concluded that sometimes the heart's wisdom exceeds cultural prohibition, and that love, when approached with honesty, respect, and scientific methodology, can bridge differences that initially seem insurmountable. He also noted that Zara had become not just his partner but his most valued colleague, and that their empathic connection enhanced rather than compromised their ability to provide exceptional care to the diverse patient population that relied on their medical expertise.